Today we have a one-off session on the UK's sanctions strategy. It's an opportunity to take some views on how the UK uses sanctions as part of its foreign policy, and I wondered if our witnesses could introduce themselves for the record. Should we go from left to right?
Certainly. Good afternoon, committee. My name is Freya Page. I'm Director of Global Outreach at a company called Caron. I'm giving evidence today in my personal capacity, but I also have experience of working almost 8 years in HM Treasury with the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation.
I'm Maya Lester. Forgive my croaky voice. I'm a barrister at Brick Chambers. My background is public law, European law. It's become very much sanctions law, so I deal with all sorts of legal issues arising out of sanctions regimes. I also have a website, globalsanctions.com, which keeps track and is updated several times a day of all sorts of sanctions legal issues.
I love legal directories. And they call you the Queen of the Sanctions Bar, I think.
We all know about legal directories.
Yes, well, I know, but still.
I sometimes wonder when Maya has time to represent her clients, given how regularly the website is updated. Anyway, I'm Tom Keating. I'm the director of the Centre for Finance and Security at RUSI, and a significant portion of our work has covered sanctions for many years, and of course that only increased after February 2022.
Thank you very much. I think that if I can just kick off, and I think what we ought to do for the sake of people who are watching this is to begin with some general questions about what sanctions are and how they work and why it's a live issue in the UK. So where shall I start? Shall I start with Tom?
Okay. So I suppose let's talk about, let's use Russia as the case study because it's a good place to start. Sanctions are tools of foreign policy that governments use to try and create an effect of some sort. It might be signalling. So, for example, the UK might issue sanctions in relation to people that are deemed to be human rights abusers. They won't have assets in the UK that we can freeze. They won't want to travel to the UK so that they would suffer from any travel ban we might put in place. But it's a message, it's a foreign policy message that we disapprove of what they're doing.
Can I interrupt you and just ask an even more basic question, which is that what's a sanction?
So I suppose the main things that sanctions do are allow the banking sector of a country to freeze the assets of the person or the company that is named in the sanction. The sanctions might put in place weapons embargoes, for example. So sanctions on Al-Shabaab or on Somalia might stop weapons being sold into Somalia. They might put travel bans in place. So we might put in bans that mean that these people can't come to the UK. It's important, I think, to recognise that historically sanctions have been a tool of the United Nations Security Council, and sanctions work best when everybody agrees that assets of person X or organisation Y should be frozen, or everybody agrees that there should be an arms embargo or there should be travel bans. But of course, in this day and age where the UN Security Council is essentially broken when it comes to any kind of agreement on sanctions, the result is that individual countries have made their own way. So the United States, most notably, for many, many years, the European Union, and then of course since Brexit, the UK has had to have its own sanctions making capability. So we take decisions in the UK at the Foreign Office to use sanctions to advance our together with our allies, foreign policy objectives. And as I say, it's probably important to make one final point here, and I can feel Maya is itching to come in. It's probably important to make one final point here, which is these are fundamentally administrative tools. They are decisions that the government takes to place sanctions on somebody, subject to certain hurdles and certain checks and so on, but they are administrative tools. And therefore, we should always be asking ourselves the question, when we use sanctions, what is our objective? What is our end goal? What are we trying to achieve? And ultimately, what needs to happen in order for the sanctions to be reversed, because you are ultimately trying to achieve a sort of change in behaviour or a diversion of activity. So very simply, we are trying to have an effect on what Putin is doing in Ukraine by using sanctions. And so we need to communicate to those who are subject to sanction how those sanctions might at some point in the future be reversed.
It can be used as a tool of foreign policy.
Yes.
Rather than sending a gunboat. It's another way of doing things.
Yes, and it's a beguiling tool to announce. I mean, I don't know if we will talk about, but obviously the government recently announced plans to introduce organised immigration crime sanctions to support the ambition to, quote-unquote, smash the gangs. Now, I would like to see the theory of change that has been written that suggests that sanctions, as part of a toolkit, are going to contribute to that mission. But yes, they are easy to announce, easy to bring forward. You don't have to send soldiers to war, and you in some ways delegate to the private sector to take action on your behalf.
Want to jump in now?
Well, you've raised an interesting question. So originally when sanctions, the League of Nations started to institutionalise sanctions, Woodrow Wilson said, this will remove the need for force. You've raised the question there, which is, what is the purpose of the sanctions? Is there any evidence that sanctions actually, is an effective way of dissuading an aggressor, or do we just use it post hoc now to punish people?
I'll just finish, and then the others I'm sure have plenty to say. It is probably fair to say that the sanctions on Iran brought Iran to the nuclear negotiation table to agree the nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, back in 2016. So that kind of period up to 2016.
South Africa.
South Africa is often cited. I also think that it's often the case, and politicians are wont to do this, that they overpromise on sanctions. When sanctions were first introduced on Russia, there were all sorts of hyperbolic phrases about smashing the Russian economy or decimating the Russian economy or crippling the Russian economy or whatever it might be. And frankly, expectations were way overblown. The EU The EU sanctions envoy has an interesting. The EU sanctions envoy has an interesting.
Overstate it the other way.
The EU sanctions envoy has an interesting characterization, which he describes sanctions as a slow puncture. And it's also important to note that no one has ever said sanctions are a singular tool that will achieve an objective by themselves. So I think in the case of Russia, the Russian central bank assets have been frozen. That's $300 billion taken off the table. So it's not as if they've done nothing, and we can debate where on the scale of stopping the war to being hopeless we are, but I think it's unfair to say that they have achieved nothing.
Maya Lester.
No, just to back up, if you're interested in just understanding a bit more about the nuts and bolts of your first question, which is what are sanctions? Obviously, they are tools of foreign policy, but in terms of what that really means, they are obviously legal instruments which are imposed either by groups of countries, so either the European Union or the United Nations, or individual countries, so now post-Brexit, the UK, very significantly the US, but also Canada, Australia, New Zealand, all sorts of jurisdictions have what have become known as unilateral sanctions. But they are instruments of law which basically do two things. One kind of sanctions are targeted sanctions, sometimes called smart sanctions. And these are lists of companies and people drawn up by governments who have generally two types of restriction aimed just at the people on the lists, the companies on the lists, and companies owned or controlled by them. First of all, financial restrictions. So within a jurisdiction, so within the United Kingdom, if we're talking about UK sanctions, all of the people and companies named on those particular lists cannot access any funds. So their assets are frozen, but also it's a criminal offence for anyone else to make funds or resources available to those people. So that's the sort of financial sanctions. And there are travel bans. So normally those people can't come to the country where the sanctions apply. And then there is so that's targeted sanctions. And then there is the everything else non-targeted sanctions, which apply across the board within the particular jurisdiction imposing the sanctions. And those are, in the case of Russia sanctions, an extremely far-reaching complex web of different kinds of restrictions on trade, export controls, a hugely complicated web of different sorts of restrictions aimed, in theory, at achieving a certain foreign policy goal. But those two basic buckets of sort of targeted sanctions and non-targeted sanctions are a feature of almost every sanctions regime. And every regime has its own particular goal, and therefore sort of, if you take Syria sanctions, for example, those originally were aimed at stopping the Assad regime from repressing democracy, or however they are labelled. And so the lists of those targeted are in theory drawn up to try to achieve the foreign policy goal. And likewise, the extent to which you have these other kinds of trade restrictions vary. So Russia is probably the most far-reaching web of current sanctions restrictions we have, but there are an awful lot of different sanctions regimes. So the particular restrictions depend on which regime we're talking about.
Could you just touch on the just tell us about the legislation that this is based on, and also I think maybe just take us by the hand to explain how does it come about that sanctions will be started? You know, what's the
So if we're talking about the UK, so all of this was done through the European Union when we were a member state. So there was not really any such thing as UK sanctions pre-Brexit, apart from terrorist asset freezing. So we always had capacity to freeze terrorist assets. But this is so the first piece of legislation to go through Parliament in the Brexit process was the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act, because the UK wanted to be able to continue to impose sanctions post-Brexit and basically to continue what the EU had been doing, but to have power to do that as the UK. So the legal framework is an act, the Sanctions Act. That act gives very broad powers to ministers to impose sanctions, to make sanctions regulations. And it also sets out the basic legal framework for people on sanctions lists to be able to challenge their sanctions, and for different kinds of sanctions to be imposed. So the targeted asset freezes, transport sanctions, all sorts of different sanctions powers are set out in the Sanctions Act. You then have, I think it's probably roughly 40, I'm not sure what the current count is, sets of regulations made under that act, so using the powers in that act. So you've got Russia regulations, you've got Syria regulations, you've got Iran regulations, and those initially, and that's where the particular restrictions relating to each regime are laid out in secondary legislation. Those originally were copied over pretty much exactly to mirror the EU sanctions, and now they are, UK secondary legislation, so they can diverge from the EU.
Yes. We'll go on to parliamentary oversight of that,
yes.
Hopefully if we get time later on, because that's probably an important part of this too. Do you have any further questions on this? Okay. So Afra.
Thank you. I just wanted to dig into that a bit more, in particular around what the foreign policy aims of our sanctions policy are, whether we're clear on that and articulating it clearly, and what would actually good communication of that look like. Perhaps Freya Page, you might be able to
certainly
come in on that.
I think broadly, I think the sanctions aims are communicated for the broad sector, particularly for those that are already actively engaged in it, such as the banks, the legal sector, and others. But I think there's very much a difference between what is government trying to communicate and to whom as well. So, for example, if government is talking to the financial institutions or to RUSI, for example, there is very much an understanding of what those aims are and the context that sits behind the sanctions. But in terms of a specific set of designations, so Tom and Maya have mentioned that they are thematic, they also targeted sanctions. I think more can be achieved in terms of how that communication can be made, and there's room for improvement. So a much clearer set of narratives around those specific designations. And I think an example I'd like to give on this is, for example, so the equivalent of the sanctions sort of implementation unit in the US, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control. They designated two people associated with a company called Foss Agro in Russia, which is a Russian sort of agricultural company. But when they designated those two individuals, they also issued an FAQ along with that to state two very specific things. First, that the two people that were designated against those sanctions did not mean that that company, that Foss Agro, was therefore considered owned or controlled by those people, which ownership and control is a very sort of knotty issue still within sanctions. And secondly, they also said that the agricultural and medical sectors in Russia as well were not the intended targets of those sanctions. And it very clearly separated the intention and behind the designation. It became very specific to those two individuals. And that was really good for industry to really understand then the intent behind the sanctions and the foreign policy goals. Because as a business in the private sector, you want to understand that you're taking that risk-based approach accordingly in line with your business, and you can make other decisions strategically accordingly. However, in the UK, we do not give that same context. We're very good at communicating the designations, and we're very good at putting that out there. But in terms of the context, the knock-on effects, the contextual basis around that with the industry, I think we could be doing a lot more to communicate that and to provide that background for private sector.
It's all pretty new as well, isn't it, for us?
Absolutely. The last couple of years have been a whirlwind of sanctions, and also, you know, when we go back a few years, sanctions were traditionally an asset freeze. It was traditionally very financial focused. So it was about freezing bank accounts, stopping assets being moved, preventing them being made available to or for the benefit of designated persons. But in the last few years particularly, we have seen a real evolution in how sanctions are used. And since 2022, with the evasion, we have really seen a complexity around sanctions hitting very niche areas, energy, trade, and in ways that we've never seen before. And it's hitting sectors and parts of industry, not just in the UK, this is a global issue, that have never really had to think about how sanctions apply to their business. And that's even more crucial then as to why those communications should be really clear and given that context. And not just that, but also, and maybe we'll come on to it later on today, but about how that outreach is also done with various different parts of sectors that have not been habitually engaged in sanctions, such as the financial sector, the legal sector, the insurance sector, who are all very well versed in how to handle lots of these issues.
Yes, I did. I didn't know, Tom, you looked
well,
like
I
you
was,
wanted to come in.
I was just simply going to say, essentially, we are deputising the private sector to prosecute foreign policy on our behalf, and therefore we need to give them all the tools that we would give to the military, to whom we deputise to go and prosecute wars for us. And I think if we want to achieve whatever the effect is, and we should clearly state at the beginning of this process, we are trying to achieve the following effect, we then need to give the private sector all the support we can give. And I do think that there is a stark contrast between the way in which the US, where all credit, they've had many, many, many years of working with their private sector in a way perhaps the UK hasn't quite had to do. There is much more guidance that comes from the United States authorities about how sanctions should be implemented than there is from the UK or indeed the EU or anywhere else.
John, you want to follow up on this, and then we'll go to Uma.
Quick one. Sanctions against individuals clearly are designed to punish them and inflict pain. They can't access their money, particularly if they've been guilty of human rights or are associated with senior figures in the regime. Then you have sanctions which are designed to stop countries doing specific things like developing very high-tech computers or missiles. So you choke off exports of, chips or something. But then there are sanctions which appear to be designed to cripple an economy and make the people conscious. So Russia is the obvious example. To what extent do you feel that sanctions are being deployed not for targeted, but actually to sort of send a general message to a people, your government is doing things that we condemn and we want you to suffer the consequences?
And if you asked the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, who are responsible for sanctions, they would say that on your first point, sanctions are not designed to punish individuals. they would say they are designed to try to coerce a change in behaviour of individuals.
Something like Magnitsky sanctions are clearly on people who have committed human rights abuses.
Magnitsky sanctions are slightly different, but I think when it comes to sort of foreign policy sanctions, they would say, my guess is they would say it's not about punishment, and that's quite an important point, because the way targeted sanctions are now imposed is that they are very rarely aimed at people for something that they have done that is wrong. So the categories of people who are potentially could be included on, say, Russia sanctions are absolutely enormous, and probably include several people in this room, by which I mean they are not wrongdoers or even those close to President Putin. The categories are now so large that they include, for example, people associated with people who used to be in business in Russia. They are that broad. So there are hundreds of thousands of people who potentially could be included on sanctions lists. And then the government picks and chooses those that they think are appropriate. Why are they that broad? They are that broad because the government are trying to cast the net as wide as they can, in principle, in order to achieve a foreign policy goal. In the case of Russia, stopping the war in Ukraine, putting it crudely. Whether they are effective, particularly in relation to changing the behaviour of those individuals, I think is a really vexed question. And one of the, I think, legitimate criticisms of these targeted sanctions is whether they actually give any incentive for the individuals who are the targets of sanctions to change behaviour. And that is something that, in my view, the government have not made clear. Why do I say that? Because there are people on those lists who have, for example, divested themselves of all their business in Russia, who have done everything they could to say, I have nothing to do with President Putin. There are some very Western-facing people on those lists. Not all, I'm not suggesting all by any means, but some. And they remain on the sanctions lists. There are other people, there have been a handful of people who have been removed from sanctions lists by the government, but the government don't say why. So there is no published policy which says, here is what we're trying to achieve, and if you do something, whether it's pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, denounce the war, whatever, you will be delisted. That has not been something. So it has been something that the government have talked about doing, but to my knowledge, it's not something that they are doing. And so it goes back to the really important question of what are they designed to achieve? Are they clear about what they're trying to achieve? And are they actually encouraging the targets of sanctions to try to achieve those goals?
And the general sanctions which are meant to, I don't know, empty shelves or put up inflation or just make life harder.
And it's all part of the same package. So if you take Russia, part of it is targeted sanctions on individuals. The other part is very far-reaching trade restrictions. What is the goal of the trade restrictions? Well, to try to, you could say, cripple an economy, to make things harder economically. And that is a pure foreign policy. Is that something that's likely to achieve change in a particular country? I mean, who knows? Sanctions are often imposed in jurisdictions where the leader of the country is unlikely to be motivated by the suffering of the people of that country. But, this is foreign policy. So in some cases, the calculation may be, as Tom said, in Iran, possibly sanctions as part of other diplomatic tools. The theory is that they can create a situation in which negotiation happens or a foreign policy goal is achieved. But I think the general calculation is sanctions alone unlikely to achieve them.
Let me move on because we've got lots of questions. If you don't mind, I'm sure that you'll get an opportunity to say what you're going to. Just let's go to Uma, who's got some challenges, I think.
Thank you. Your point on the government not being entirely clear on what they want to achieve by the sanctions is quite interesting. What is the point of having sanctions in place if the end outcome is not being made clear? Surely then that, what does it achieve? If the Tom, you said earlier, what do we want to see changed or reversed? If that's not set out from the offset, what is the point of putting sanctions in?
Well, I think that's a question that you should put to the FCDO because I'm not, responsible for foreign policy, I'm pleased to say. I think it depends at what level you're asking that question. I think what the FCDO would say is that if you have enough people on sanctions lists, they have a theory that somehow pressure will be put on President Putin to change his foreign policy. And one of the issues, not to get too legalistic, but that's been in the Supreme Court last week, is to what extent does the government need to show that each individual designation, each person added to the list, could make a difference in itself. Or I think the government's theory is if you have enough thousands of people on lists, you are seen to be doing something which will impose pressure on the government.
I'm going to allow myself to slightly disagree, which is I think it's pretty clear what the Foreign Office wants to achieve with the Russia sanctions regime, for example. Where I think it becomes more complex is if you interrogate individual decisions that are made as part of that regime. So, for example, why was a particular, to use the way Maya described it before, why was a particular sort of non-targeted decision made to restrict legal services to the provision of legal services to Russia and that sort of thing. So I think where the question that I think the Foreign Office needs to ask is, if you go back to the sanctions regime that you started to put in place late at night in February 2022, you should be looking at those and saying, have they achieved the objective that you had in mind at the time? Are they working against us rather than against the Kremlin? Very possibly. Are they in any way achieving this overarching objective to restrict the funding and resourcing of the Russian military and therefore cripple its ability to fight its war in Ukraine? And if not, then we should consider reversing those sanctions. And I think there is a bit of work that needs to happen in the FCDO, which is to go through that period and say, realistically, we know what we're trying to achieve as a high-level objective. How are these individual decisions made over the last 3 years contributing to that?
And the parliamentary oversight is something we'll come back to. I think it keeps coming back to that as well. Go on.
Well, to that, Chair. So thank you for that. So in light of what you said, and we take on board the FCDO point, do you think the government could be bolder in its use of sanctions, including Magnitsky-style sanctions?
I think they could be. I think that they are missing an opportunity to have a real win when it comes to targeted sanctions, because they could be clear with the targets of sanctions what they want them to do. And if they undertook those steps, be it, put money into a pot for the reconstruction of Ukraine, be it divest themselves from Russia, if they were willing to say, if you do those things, we will take you off the sanctions list and we will count it as a foreign policy win, I think that is a missed opportunity. They could be achieving that. And because of the lack of clarity around this policy at the moment, it's not something that is being achieved.
But that relates to individuals. I mean, the bottom line is that every time we issue sanctions, the Russian economy sees us coming a mile away. And therefore, actually, the mistake, I would argue, that we've made over the last 3 years is we've tiptoed down the sanctions road at a point where, to coin a phrase, maybe shock and awe would have been more effective. But we've been nervous about roiling energy markets, roiling food security around the world, and all of that. And the result is that we've kind of done a little bit, but I like to draw to mind the Monty Python fish slapping sketch, where we've just done, if you know the one I'm referring to, we've done the little tip-tap, tip-tap. Actually, we should have got out the big fish like at the end of the sketch and slapped the guy into the canal. So I think, realistically, we probably haven't lent into sanctions as much as we could have done because of other considerations like, as I say, energy security and food security.
I appreciate you've mentioned Russia, but I've in a previous session pushed the Foreign Secretary on why we've not sanctioned individuals from previous regime in Sri Lanka, for example, where we've seen the USA and Canada impose Magnitsky sanction on certain individuals. So we're now lagging behind. That's a clear example of the US and Canada putting sanctions in and we haven't. What, in your opinion, stops us being bold on things like this? With Sri Lanka aside, there's a clear example of the US and Canada having done it and we've not. Is that a Foreign Office? Is there a general reluctance in the Foreign Office to put sanctions in?
I mean, the answer to that is it will be a foreign policy decision that, with sanctions, the government is always open to the criticism of picking and choosing where it wants to impose sanctions and where it doesn't. But I would just make one comment on the human rights sort of sanctions, which is that those are generally, for better or worse, symbolic, by which I mean most people on these global human rights sanctions lists don't have assets in the UK. And since all our sanctions regimes do is freeze assets in the UK, basically, The question is, is it really bold to put people on global human rights sanctions lists? I mean, is there actually a value in signalling that we disapprove of these people, or could the government actually be bolder and, for example, put resources into helping prosecute corruption in those jurisdictions, helping in a very real way with law, because they are symbolic. You may think symbolism is a good thing, but they're certainly not achieving a concrete goal.
All right, very good.
I wanted to circle back to the topic that we touched upon earlier, which was around guidance to the private sector.
Oh, hang on, before we do that, I
yeah.
think Blair had a question. I'm so sorry.
Go.
Yeah, I'm so sorry.
At the risk of sounding like a politician who wants to gather more power for himself, can I ask you about your views on whether Parliament's role in sanctions, and both kind of the, I guess, not just the scrutiny of sanctions, but also commissioning of them is appropriate? Or maybe as someone who's been the gamekeeper, maybe ask you first.
No worries. So I think in terms of scrutiny, I think there's already a good amount of scrutiny. I think there's already various avenues that can already be taken through Parliament to have very constructive debates on sanctions. I think there is...
We're always... Sorry, hang on. But we've... I mean, Blair and I have had the same experience where we've gone into the chamber and said, why aren't you sanctioning X, Y and Z? And we're simply told, well, we don't discuss sanctions.
I mean, yes, I mean, there's also a very critical role, I think, where when you're looking at designations, targeted designations, and when you're looking at creating that policy, the risk always, certainly from within government and from my experience, has been to ensure the integrity of that information, that data, because what you don't want to risk is having certain discussions made public to tip off potential targets or areas that risk asset flight. And if you really want to make those sanctions effective, you don't want to give anybody a chance to move their assets out of the UK before there's a chance to really have that pinch point, so you have that ability to, to use sanctions to bring people to that negotiating table to understand, that sort of messaging that you're putting through.
The trouble with that, though, and I think this is the frustration the Chair and I have felt, is that a government which is being very active in preparing sanctions looks exactly the same as a government who are kicking an issue into the long grass and trying to delay things, and it's very difficult for the purposes of as parliamentarians or as the public we represent to know which is which.
Yes. Cameron said, that in the summer, so it's not like, so they've had a long time to think about it. I mean, the targets have. That he was that the Foreign Office were thinking of sanctioning a couple of the most extreme members of the Israeli cabinet, and that a plan was in place. And he didn't explain why he hadn't implemented it, but he said a plan was in place. And so whenever we ask about it, we just get back from the Foreign Office that they don't discuss sanctions.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, like I said, because it is balancing that sort of confidentiality of that sort of foreign policy with national security, and making sure that there is sort of the right process in place, and allowing that sort of slight separation does allow for appropriate scrutiny and debate as well, and a place for escalation. But I think there is something there to be said about having more open conversation. Maybe that should be in a sort of a
Foreign Affairs Select Committee,
maybe potentially, or maybe a sanctions select committee or something like that could be set up with the pure focus of ensuring that confidentiality, ensuring that focus, where it actually is a lot safer to discuss those issues, and actually might lead to sort of better sort of transparency between Parliament and government itself before it obviously announces policy.
Can I build on that as well? Because I mentioned as well, my first question, the commissioning of sanctions as well. So other jurisdictions, other parliaments will have, particularly the United States, the power to actually initiate sanctions. And I wonder whether that's not just something which is about giving more power to the legislature, but is also maybe helpful in some instances to the executive, because the same hand that's holding the carrot isn't holding the stick at the same time, because as ministers you're going to Russia's an easy example because we have such a cold relationship with them, but many countries where sanctions are in place are countries where we have existing commercial relationships with. I just wonder whether would it be better for ministers to be going into these rooms not being the ones who have initiated the sanctions, so that they can have the conversation about the commercial relationship separate from the relationship that's about the...
I mean, there's definitely room for more involvement, and certainly with the private sector as well, I think, to understand effective implementation. There are definitely gaps there as well. But I don't know if Maya or Tom wanted to have any thoughts on this as well.
I think that there's very little debate in Parliament about sanctions. I think there is a massive amount of executive power with almost no parliamentary scrutiny in this field. So yes, there's obviously the parliamentary statutory framework, but for example, when the Russia regulations came in, all of the sanctions regulations pretty much are, I think, under the made affirmative procedure. So they are sort of retrospectively approved, but there is no debate in Parliament really about the kinds of issues that you've been talking about here of, has a cost-benefit analysis actually being done? Is this the right way to go? What are the alternatives? And if you bear in mind the enormous powers that government has and the delegation of powers to ministers, both to put people on sanctions lists, but also all the other spheres, I think it's an area that could benefit enormously from more parliamentary scrutiny. And there have been, I think, 6 or 7 now different committee reports over the years, during the Brexit process and before that, but different committees of Parliament reporting on sanctions issues that have been enormously valuable.
I'm all in favour of parliamentary scrutiny. The only thing I would say is that, and it's important, I think, to draw a distinction between the Russia regime, where everyone is pulling in the same direction, and slightly picking up on a point that was made over here, is when we have sanctions discussions at RUSI, and I saw this with my own eyes just a couple of months ago, you had people at one end of the table who were from the Sanctions Directorate, right? So they want to pull the sanctions levers, they're itching to pull the trigger. And at this end of the table, there was a group of Foreign Office officials who represented the XYZ desk that we were discussing. And there was clear tension between those two ends of the table. And I think the one of the reasons why I kind of, I suppose, somewhat favour the model we have right now, although one should always have more scrutiny, is that when the diplomats go to these countries, they are kind of pulling and pushing on different levers. And one of those levers is, well, we have the opportunity to kind of issue sanctions, but on the other hand, we've got this opportunity to offer you this. And I think if you view sanctions in pure isolation, there's a risk that you overlook, if you like, the other foreign policy objectives you had. Back to the original point, sanctions are a tool in the foreign policy toolbox. Now, we should scrutinise the government's foreign policy as relates to Sri Lanka, for example. What role should sanctions have in that? You should be querying that. But suggesting that person X or person Y should be on the list, as they might do in the US, maybe that's a different step.
But surely it would be helpful for somebody who's, I don't know, let's say the British ambassador to Egypt is able to go and speak to the powers that be and say, we've got this up-and-coming parliamentarian called Blair McDougall. He's a real pain in the neck, but at the moment he wants X, Y and Z sanction because they're responsible for the imprisonment of, whatever British citizen it is, and it's...
I don't dispute that, and indeed there are NGOs who have
UMA and what's happening.
Yeah, I mean there are NGOs that have a pipeline into the Foreign Office and can suggest packages of, we think this person should be added to the human rights, the global human rights regime, and that sort of thing. So, there are plenty of opportunities to feed ideas into the Foreign Office.
Your view is that the benefit of being in the room to have the wider discussion is greater than the risk of the conversation about sanctions, or for that matter any other kind of challenge being pushed down the agenda in those meetings.
I think so, if I understand the question correctly. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, Ed.
Thank you. I just wanted to return to what we were talking about earlier, about the private sector and understanding the guidance, and more broadly around sort of circumnavigation of sanctions as well, because there was some interesting numbers around the fact that prior to the war in Ukraine breaking out, UK car exports to Azerbaijan were valued about 58 million. After the war in Ukraine had broken out and the sanctions that had been imposed on Russia, car exports to Azerbaijan reached 523 million, so a tenfold increase. British exports of heavy machinery to Kyrgyzstan increased 1,100%, I'm guessing from a fairly low bar. But my question is, are sanctions effective if we're going to see that level of, private companies circumnavigating it? And is that a sign that these companies don't understand the sanctions that are being imposed? Is that a lack of clarity of guidance from the UK government? And I don't know, to start, Maya, I'll start with you.
Okay, so one thing about sanctions not being imposed by the UN is that they are only imposed by and effective in the jurisdictions where they apply. So people talk about sanctions circumvention by the likes of China or Kazakhstan or wherever, but the fact is our sanctions simply don't apply to those countries. And so it's not that they're circumventing them, they just simply don't sign up to our policy on Russia sanctions. So what does the government do about that? So they are engaged in a massive diplomatic effort to go to third countries and to try to persuade them that actually they shouldn't be trading with Russia, they should be signing up to our foreign policy. But it's difficult because China is enormously enriched by the fact that we have stringent sanctions on Russia.
Those are country-level issues. I guess what I'm trying to understand is that if a British manufacturer is exporting to a third country with the clear understanding, there's absolutely no way that demand for heavy machinery and drones parts in Kyrgyzstan has shot up by 1,100% overnight. There's a clear pathway that that's going into Russia. So is that a lack of understanding amongst British companies, or is that a lack of enforcement? Why is it that a British manufacturer feels that they can do that when it is clearly, if not breach of the literal sanction, then certainly what the sanction is trying to achieve?
Ed Conway at Sky News would love this discussion. So I think the reality is that we have tended to approach everybody who is responsible for implementing sanctions as if they were a bank, right? So there are many companies in this country that had no clue about sanctions before February 2022. We've worked hard, I think, to educate them, but there's kind of clearly more that can be done there. I think I honestly don't believe that there are companies in the UK that are, if you like, actively engaged in circumvention. What I do think is that there are companies in the UK that are ignorant. And as I said to this committee previously, if your sales to Kyrgyzstan have gone up by 500% over the last year, that is not a reason to go celebrate in the pub. That is a reason to look at your order book and try and understand why that has happened. Now, just to make sure that there's one point which I think gets overlooked, but I just want to make sure people understand. I'm not giving this as an excuse, but many companies used to export to Russia as the first stop within the Eurasian Economic Union. They can no longer do that. So if they want to export to the Eurasian Economic Union, then they now have to export to somewhere else in the Eurasian Economic Union. And that might be Kazakhstan, and then onward. Now, I'm not saying that explains all this massive spike, but it is something which we kind of just need to bear in mind. But fundamentally, it's about educating the private sector and making sure the private sector knows what is expected of it, has the tools to analyse its supply chain, and we'll, I think, come on to enforcement, knows that if it gets it wrong, then it's going to face consequences. And we have not delivered consequences on industry in this country to create a teachable moment. I know from my own time at JP Morgan, when one of my competitors got blown out of the water by the US authorities, you worked all night to understand why that was and to make sure it didn't happen to you. And we have not created those teachable moments in the UK over the last 3 years.
I think Freya wanted to answer as well.
Thank you, Dave. I mean, I was just going to come in on that and actually largely to agree with Tom there, because I think you would really struggle to find any sort of witting breaches in the UK, certainly within the UK financial institutions, in the banking, legal, and also the insurance sector. And I think this also speaks very specifically to the complexities that we've seen with the Russia sanctions and how they've really sort of mushroomed and grown, where those that are very experienced and well versed in sanctions more broadly, again, those three sectors that I named, but we're now looking at sectors that have never previously had to engage in sanctions. If you speak to a manufacturer of, auto parts or microchips, whatever it is that they're sort of shipping, and they're using third countries to sort of evade, these companies, they all know export control restrictions, absolutely, they will know their export requirements, but they won't understand export sanctions requirements, and that is the difference. And it's very different. This is, I think, critically where it comes to the improvement and certainly importance that needs to be put on government outreach to these sectors. We see a lot of outreach happening. It's very London-centric, which is good. The banking sector's here. There's lots of very important business that is worked out of London. But actually, the businesses and the areas that you really want to be targeting are not based in London, and it needs to be a lot broader. There needs to be a bit more for government outreach going broader on that.
Can I just for clarity's sake, any investigation into any kind of breach would fall within the National Crime Agency's purview?
Yes and no. I think enforcement, I don't know if we'll come on to that a bit later, and I can probably go into a bit more detail about how the enforcement is split in government. And again, this speaks, I think, to a slightly more fragmented process where we have the National Crime Agency, which is the law enforcement partner for OFSI, the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. And then you have HMRC, who is the law enforcement partner for the newly established since October, the Office of Trade Sanctions Implementation. You also have Border Force as well.
If the NCA is pretty experienced at dealing with the financial services sector, is there any evidence that HMRC is fulfilling its duty? I mean, is it investigating, to Tom's point about learning opportunities? That what we're talking about there is somebody being hung out to dry as and being made an example of. Is HMRC doing that? So
there's a slight problem here, I think, in terms of the enforcement. And if you're happy, I can go on to explain a bit more on this. The National Crime Agency, the UK actually itself, if you're looking at sort of criminal investigations, we are amongst the best in the world at doing what we do. We have a very good legal process, and we know what a good investigation should look like. The National Crime Agency, they investigate crime. They are essentially a police force. And they get thousands of suspicious activity reports a day from banks, money laundering and various other criminal activities. They do have a kleptocracy cell, which is specifically around Russian oligarchs. But that's not just a sanctions problem. That's also looking at things like corruption, and it's looking at bribery and other offences as well. And sanctions is only a crime when evasion happens. And the evasion of sanctions doesn't actually very rarely happen within UK borders. It happens outside, as you mentioned, third countries is where the evasion and circumvention is happening. So therefore, what role does the NCA have in administering criminal enforcement capabilities on extraterritorial, on offences that is happening outside of the UK border? For me, sanctions does not sit in their wheelhouse. It's not for the want of NCA not trying, but it's very difficult for the NCA to get time with the CPS and see a case through when it's fighting for very valuable court time on things, domestic issues, murders and other things that are happening that the taxpayer will want to see brought to justice. So it's very difficult to then say to the CPS, well, why should you not bring that sort of murder trial? We actually have got this oligarch or this Russian company who's been buying microchips from a company somewhere. So it's very difficult with that. And then, of course, you have HMRC, and they have been imposing compound penalties on businesses for breaches of trade sanctions, of UK trade sanctions. But they do not work. And the reason for that is that it's not a sanctions enforcement tool. It's a criminal tool, and they start as a criminal case. But when that case goes through and CPS say, actually, we don't want to continue with that anymore, it then gets settled out of court. And because of that settlement, it is confidential. And we know that enforcement drives compliance, and particularly in this area where we're looking at businesses who are evading through third countries, you need to get that message across, and enforcement is the best way of doing that. It sets a standard, it sets a legal precedent. But if you cannot make those cases public, you have no lessons that the industry is learning. There is nothing to take from it. You don't understand, even in the private sector, even within government, certainly other areas of government do not understand the details of these cases. So it's hard to understand where the outreach is needed, where there's a real need for support, for guidance, because we don't know any of these things. So I think it's important that we look at what tools we have. I think we need a review on where that enforcement sits, because currently we have the FCDO as the implementer, cascading down to, I think it's 4 different implementing departments, working with 3 different law enforcement bodies, because Border Force, of course, assists with HMRC at the UK border. It's not coming from one HMG, and there's a lot of fragmentation within that. But I don't know if Maya or Tom want to come in on any of those points.
Just to back up a bit, the UK has criminal and civil sanctions enforcement powers. There has been only one, to my knowledge, sanctions criminal case, which is now being brought by the NCA. But there's been almost no criminal enforcement of sanctions breaches. But our case would go to the National Crime Agency if it was seen as serious enough, if it was seen as a criminal case. The primary sanctions enforcement is done by OFSI, not by the NCA, and that's because OFSI have the civil fining powers. They're part of the Treasury. And they can impose significant fines. They haven't done it in very many cases. They have indicated that there are more to come. But the principal way in which that works, and I think it's really important to say, is that the UK have enormously onerous reporting duties on industry to report on suspected breaches of sanctions. So if you have reasonable grounds to suspect that there has been a sanctions breach, you have to report it to the Treasury. So the Treasury is sitting on, as in the anti-money laundering sphere as well, they are sitting on enormous numbers of self-reports and reports by banks of transactions that come in. And that forms mainly the body from which they will then investigate where to breach. The difficulty with that situation is simply that there is certainly a risk that therefore those who will be penalised by civil fines are those who have done the right thing, as it were, and reported. They are almost by definition the more compliant. So will we start to see fines being imposed for, my impression is it is more people making mistakes in a context of enormously onerous, fast-paced, changing sanctions restrictions rather than knowing criminal evaders of sanctions. Obviously, there might be some of those, but exactly as Freya has said, I think they're few and far between.
I think Alex has got some more questions on this.
Following up on this, thank you, Freya. I mean, your example of saying it was very difficult to find examples of sanction breaches, and then I guess the evidence of there only being one criminal sanction in the last year shows that they are hard to find. You also said that the system is very fragmented with many different actors in it. I think you gave a good example of why we need a review, but I wonder, what would you change? How would you organise it differently? Are there lessons to be learned from the way the Americans do it in the way we prosecute those sanctions, so that we can ensure that where there are breaches, that the system works and we catch them and they're publicly put to account?
Great question. I think the US model, I think whilst I think a lot of people are very aware of the sort of extraterritoriality that the US has. It has a very different legislative framework to what we do.
I'm sorry, just for people watching,
yes.
Do you mind just giving us a couple of sentences to explain that?
Yes, absolutely.
If you remember the public, you might know about this.
Of course, thank you. So they have secondary sanctions which apply outside of the US border. It applies to anything connected largely with the dollar, and the dollar being obviously very important in terms of global trade. It means that US sanctions have much more far-reaching effect. They also have, they implemented it just over a year ago now, Executive Order 14114, which applies to foreign financial institutions who may be involved in supporting or involved in breaches involving Russia's war effort, which then also makes them liable to US fines and enforcement action, which can be eye-watering, as we've seen lots of US action happen over the years. So UK institutions, UK private sector is very aware of the risk of US enforcement. So I don't necessarily think that's the model, certainly in our current framework, that I think would work for us. We do have, and talking to sort of the slight sort of fragmentation of what we have, and following on from the previous point, we do now have OTSI as well. So Maya mentioned OFSI in relation to the financial sanctions implementation unit. We now have OTSI, the trade equivalent. I think it's important as well just to outline that when OTSI was established, largely we were all expecting OTSI to come in and be able to deal exactly in the issues and the cases that I outlined. HMRC is currently not able to bring about through their compound penalties. However, OTSI's remit has been changed to, I guess, what everybody else was expecting, and they're actually only looking at third country shipments now. They're not looking at the domestic and UK at the border offences, which is slightly, I think, sort of cutting at the wings really of what OTSI can really do. So I think there's room, I would like to think, of maybe expanding that position for OTSI so that it doesn't just do the third country trade services, but it actually does domestic trade export controls as well and takes over that civil enforcement responsibility. Ultimately, there's great work happening across government, I do have to say, with even given the framework of how it is at the moment, there's lots of people working extremely hard, putting together what is a very difficult policy and trying to make it, trying to implement it. And that's coming from a place of where lots of civil servants are struggling to understand private sector, because there is a lack of expertise there as well in terms of understanding how banking works, how corporate structures work, how trade and export actually works, how does shipping goods work. So understanding that, I think, definitely needs to be increased, and I think this would be a great way of bringing the sanctions units together. I would love to see, personally, sort of a joint unit, a centre of excellence, where we would have a sanctions hub, and that would maybe still sit under one department, likely the Foreign Office, potentially. I guess that makes sense in terms of the foreign policy aspect. But actually it brings all the units together where information can better be shared. Lots of sanctions offences may involve different aspects. It might involve financial, it might involve trade, maybe immigration, or even Department for Transport, who also have a role in the maritime and aviation sanctions as well. So I think that would be a lot better. It would also permit the civil servants who are working in sanctions to actually make a career out of it. It's a very niche area of policy, and I think the issue we have at the moment is that and this isn't a comment about any particular department, this is just a civil service, it leans itself to a very generalist skill set where you can work around the civil service from different departments and different policy areas, and it's great. You can build up a really good level of skills to work and to turn your hand to these things. But sanctions is very, very different because it balances the foreign policy, the diplomacy, the defence, national security, humanitarian. There's lots of different things that come together in it, and it's very litigious. And I think if you had a unit as well that just looked at sanctions, it would allow for good career development, it would allow for expertise in the same way that the US do. That's one thing that the US are very good at, is that within their public sector, you don't see the churn of every 18 months, 2 years that we have here in the UK. You get people that stay there and actually become specialists, and we should be encouraging of the specialist across the civil service. I think that would really do us well.
Thank you. One more question around deterrence. You mentioned that there are many cases that HMRC settles and it's not made public. Why is that? Surely the government would be incentivised to make these cases public to act as a deterrent. I don't understand.
It's purely because of the nature of the compound penalties. So in legislation, it's because they're settled out of court, and maybe Maya, as our legal expert today on the panel, can speak more to it. But for that reason, they cannot be made public. But I do think we should look at a different avenue of being able to do that. I think it's crucial to compliance.
It's not just HMRC. I mean, I obviously do the same thing. So they have published the number of investigations that have been settled without a public decision being made, and that's obviously their policy decision as to how they settled that case. But I think definitely a disadvantage of doing it that way is that you don't have very many public decisions with sort of lessons learned. And I think, for my part, that the US has a much better system of enforcement. I mean, first of all, they are a much better resourced set of prosecuting agencies in the US. You get DOJ involved as well, and some very serious eye-watering fines in the sanctions sphere that really make people sit up. But also what they do very well is they use enforcement decisions as an opportunity to teach lessons, and they have very well drafted, here are 10 reasons why we chose this particular company as a target for real investigations. and what other companies can learn from this. That's just not been a feature of Ofsi's practice so far.
Phil.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to draw the committee's attention to my role as the Vice Chair of the APPG on Magnitsky Sanctions and Reparation, and also my previous role as a Financial Crime Compliance Officer for more than 10 years. And with that in mind, I wanted to ask a question of Tom, if that's okay, about offshore overseas territories, UK overseas territories. We talked about jurisdictions earlier. Transparency International has previously identified shell companies and trusts in the UK overseas territories having been used to evade sanctions for Russian oligarchs to the tune of circa £700 million. To what extent do you believe secrecy jurisdictions, including the overseas territories, allow for designated individuals or entities to evade sanctions? And what should the British government be doing about that? And maybe come to Freya after Tom, if that's okay.
Okay, I knew someone would roll the OT's grenade on the table. Look, I mean, the bottom line is that the UK is steward of a global sort of financial infrastructure, and therefore we should ensure that it is part of the solution rather than part of the problem. And in the case of sanctions, I think we should ensure that we are calling out those territories. The territories are quick to say the data we have is fantastic. We have verified company registries, for example, which we still don't have yet in the UK, and we need to basically bring to bear that information in order to help those who are investigating cases of sanctions, circumvention or evasion. I mean, I would refer to the fact that when the Russia sanctions were first brought forward, jurisdictions like Jersey, I think, very quickly identified up to $7 billion of assets connected with one particular individual that were in trusts or companies or whatever the structure was there. So these jurisdictions have the capability. The question is, do they have the resource to use that capability for good? And I think some of them do, and I would point to Jersey, noting it's a Crown dependency, not an overseas territory. Others have really struggled, and British Virgin Islands is obviously such an example. I remember when the Russian full-scale invasion occurred, there happened to be, I think, a minister visited the BVI and made some sort of speech, and I thought, brilliant, she's going to leave behind 6 civil servants to help the BVI go through all that information that it has, and of course that didn't happen. And I know from a visit I made to the BVI not long after the Russian full-scale invasion, they struggled with the responsibility. So I think, yes, they need to make sure their house is in order, but we frankly need to help them use the data and information that they have in order to contribute to circumvention investigations, making sure that they actually know who is running money through the companies that are registered there. One last point I would say is that there is a very well-trodden route between UK and these territories in the form of exchange of notes, and if you speak to people at the National Crime Agency or the Serious Fraud Office or other relevant agencies, they will tell you whenever we want information from those jurisdictions and we request it under the exchange of notes, we get that information. So the question in my mind is, are we empowering, or do those jurisdictions have the necessary resources to exploit the information they have, other than when they are requested to do so by the NCA or anyone else?
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow on from that, not much. Tom's covered it off really nicely, but I do think there is a bigger part that we should be playing in supporting. Resource is an issue, and I know that certainly when I was part of Ofsi, we would do capacity building, and I think that still does go on in terms of supporting the overseas territories, going out there, spending some time and actually teaching and going through processes on how to better implement enforcement and licensing, and how you can improve outreach, and how you can improve reporting requirements, and understanding the sectors and businesses that are seen in those various territories, and how you can have better oversight. So I do think there's a role to be played, not just doing it every now and then, but I think there should be more done in terms to support that, and also providing that resource, because I think there is definitely a struggle within these territories to really justify. They're often very small units, a handful of people at most, and some of them are only starting now to really start to develop their own FIU, their own financial intelligence unit, to really give them chance to start to get some powers and start getting a lot more operational in terms of how they're dealing with this. So I think we should continue that support and allow us to really enable them to make their own decisions and build their own teams that they can focus on sanctions as a priority.
I mean, it seems to me that there's a number of these jurisdictions, and some of them have moved quicker than others in terms of addressing concerns around financial crime writ large, but others seem more reluctant to move, partly because of concerns around the impact it'll have on their own economy, but also because they've got a strong concentration of financial services. It's, I think, very difficult for UK to talk about sanctions enforcement as a tool of foreign policy if there's a potential for that being undermined in our own backyard. I just wonder if anybody had any thoughts on that when Britain's going out on the global stage talking about, tackling dirty money.
I think there are that's a problem in two places. So I'll come back to your point in a second, but it's also a problem when we go to third countries to talk about circumvention. That was the question earlier on. And those countries can quite rightly turn around and say, well, when did you last prosecute somebody for sending stuff to a country that then got circumvented to Russia? So I think what we do at home matters writ large when it comes to sanctions implementation. I think the question around overseas territories is frankly more of a problem on financial crime generally than just sanctions, because it is very easy. I mean, everybody remembers the president of Nigeria when he came here for David Cameron's anti-corruption summit back in 2016, and David Cameron made a hot mic comment, and the next day he was asked, President Buhari was asked, do you want an apology from the Prime Minister? He said, no, I want my money back because it's all stashed in property in London. So I think we still have a reputational issue. Yep. I know the Foreign Secretary has stood in front of various former tube stations to try and kind of launch his campaign against illicit finance. But fundamentally, people only take us seriously when we confiscate assets and when we prosecute people. And talking strong and doing social media campaigns is the beginning of a very long journey. So as with all these topics, we need to be confiscating assets, we need to be arresting people where we can, and we need to be prosecuting them through the force of law. And simply sanctioning people and freezing their assets doesn't get us there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Abdesam.
Thank you. So just following on from that question in terms of lack of prosecution, if there is no prosecution, does that sort of give a free way to the companies, the individuals, the countries that we're intending to sanction by the lack of prosecutions that are taking place?
Well, if you were to survey banks around the world, companies around the world, and said, when it comes to sanctions, what are you afraid of? They will come back to you with 4 letters, OFAC. They won't come back to you with OFSI or National Crime Agency or any other agency in the world. So fundamentally, people are concerned about enforcement from the United States. And back to the conversation from earlier on, until we have demonstrated teachable moments to industry, to individuals, that the UK actually has bite behind its bark, then you can't expect them to be concerned about the UK as an enforcement power. So, for the time being, everybody is a long way behind the United States. And I think with the independence that the UK has in its sanctions regime now, we can afford to be tougher. We don't have to kind of move in step with the European Union. Now, we are never going to have the reputation of OFAC. We don't have the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar and everything that comes with that. But there is certainly more that the UK can do to make it clear, to Phil's point, to make it clear that we take the issue seriously enough to prosecute companies and individuals in our own country before perhaps going out and lecturing others.
Just coming on to third countries then, and how countries that we might implement sanctions against would circumnavigate the policy that we currently have. How do you think we could work with those countries, other than diplomatic efforts, which might not work, to encourage that they work with the sanctions that we implement?
I think and this is why I think it's really important to consider, particularly in this sort of circumvention topic you're talking about, which obviously these days mainly relates to Russia, is to bear in mind that this is a diplomatic conversation. It is no surprise to me that the leading people who are going to Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan or Malaysia or wherever it might be to talk about circumvention are diplomats, because fundamentally you are trying to persuade that country to fall into line with what we as the UK and Ukraine's allies want to occur. And so simply turning up there and saying, you need to enforce our sanctions is going to get you nowhere. What you are trying to do is to make it clear to them that there are these so-called critical high priority items. So there are 50 items, just 50 items, that the Sanctions Coalition really, really cares about when it comes to circumvention. So certain types of technologies, certain kinds of optical sites for weapon systems, Russia. And by the way, it's probably 0.00001% of your economy. So it's that kind of conversation that I think we need to be having, rather than turning up and saying, hello, we want to have a neo-colonial conversation with you about doing what's decided in London. And I think what has been learnt over the last 3 years is that if you go down the route that I described, countries will actually start to move in your direction on that particular point. Now, unfortunately, we can't have that conversation with the Chinese, who circumvent everything, and in a way drive a coach and horses through all the efforts that we're making in Central Asia or in Southeast Asia. But that's the way to have the conversation, not I'm here from London, please do what I ask.
How do we deal with countries who might say that we have a double standards in relation to our sanctions?
That comes up all the time. I mean, we have the opportunity to travel the world and talk to people about sanctions, and I have Whitehall on my business card because that's where Russia is located, and that's one of the first things people normally point to. Probably why I'm not a diplomat, but I think the conversation around, okay, I hear what you say, but do you think it's right that a neighbouring country should simply, with absolutely no reason whatsoever, invade an innocent neighbouring country? I think everyone can agree that is out of order and illegal. And what we want to do is to talk about how we can remediate that issue. But we have to go to these countries willing to have the diplomatic conversation, which is always going to be a push and pull. And there is no doubt that if you are the diplomats from the Foreign Office, you would have heard precisely the challenge that you've just raised on multiple occasions. Yet they are managing to turn the tide in many of these countries and limit, to the extent possible, circumvention. Can I just say one thing about cars, by the way, because we get very hung up on cars, and in fact, there's a very good story overnight from Bloomberg in Japan about grand pianos going from Japan to Russia. But I think we kind of need to focus on the things that matter, and that are these critical high priority items. I'm just going to get that off my chest.
Just a very small question to Freya. How do we target networks rather than individuals who will be across a range of different countries?
Interesting point. I mean, a lot of that, and I can, I guess, speak with my Caron hat on, it is understanding how these networks operate, because when a target is sanctioned or an entity or an area is sanctioned, that business gets pushed out. They don't just say, oh, I've been sanctioned, I'm going to give up and go home and take up a new job. Those networks will push out, they will go underground. So for me, it's understanding those networks, it's understanding the behaviour and the evasion typologies, and how do they think, how those illicit actors still continue to work, how do they manage their sort of business divestments, their personal relationships, old business contacts, how are they still enabling that? And that comes down to research and data, and it's not being afraid of certainly within government to understand that where the gaps are, where they don't know. Government has a wealth of information, but it is not privy to the sort of information that banks hold. They have huge amounts of client privilege information in terms of transactions and banking. So there's a big role there to understand from an open source basis on how that information can be used to inform government decisions. When it comes to designations, understanding and really mapping out networks to ensure that those listings are being as disruptive as possible to a network, to sort of expose or sort of move out those evasion networks. but also the private sector as well. And I have to say, actually, there's from certainly my experience and from where I sit currently, the private sector is a lot more engaged and a lot more well informed in terms of how evasion is happening than I believe government is at the moment. And that's purely down to the resource that is being put in by the private sector. They are aware of the risk. They are fully cognizant that if they are committing a breach, they will get hauled over the coals and be made an example of. And the reputational damage and the remediation cost as well is far too great for them to take that risk. So we see a lot of private sector companies, corporations, banks in particular, really pulling in on all sorts of areas, arming themselves with information and data to make informed decisions. And that includes things like, I think Maya and Tom mentioned it earlier on as well, in terms of understanding where your exposure is to third country evasion. It might be that understanding what customers you have on your banking list who have been dealing with or trading in certain of these 50 high priority listed items. Being able to understand how those transactions have either increased in volume or all of a sudden your customer who's been doing business directly is now going via Uzbekistan or Georgia or Armenia. It's looking at sort of the behaviour and understanding a bit more of a business analysis on your customers. But again, where government needs to improve, I think is relying on, or not relying on, but in investing in this information, investing in tools. And I don't say that coming just from Carolyn. There's a whole variety of different tools out there that should be worked together, because government alone does not have all the information, all the answers. And the private sector as well would also be very willing to support government in its work and its understanding, because there's a lot of information sitting there that I think could also be helpful to government to understand, again, how these networks evolve, because it's constantly moving.
Can I turn to a different issue? And I think this is going to be principally for Maya. There's been a lot of discussion in Parliament and in international gatherings about the reconstruction of Ukraine and the potential use of frozen Russian assets to fund it. I'm not a lawyer, unlike our chair, but can I ask you, to what extent do you think it would be possible for the UK to legislate to allow assets held in this country, either by the Russian government or by individual Russians associated with Putin's regime, to be used for that purpose?
And for that to then sit with international law?
Mm.
I think this is also one for Tom, because RUSI have done quite a lot of interesting work on it. But just my opener on this, I mean, legislation now provides for freezing and not seizing. And I think there are two very distinct, different cases. One is if you're talking about seizing the assets of individuals on these sanctions lists. I think that would be an enormous step and potentially extremely problematic. And that's firstly because, as I mentioned earlier, people on the Russia sanctions list are mainly not there because they are said to have done anything wrong. They're on those lists because they fall within extremely broad criteria, which include, currently or formally, carrying on business of a sector of the Russian economy. So for those individuals who are not said to have done anything unlawful, going in and seizing their property would be a quite extraordinary and unprecedented thing to do, as you can imagine. And generally in this country, we haven't gone in for expropriation of property without enormous legal ramifications. So for me, seizing the property of individuals would be hugely problematic. We do have very well-established legislation for seizing the proceeds of crime. So where there is criminal activity, there are already legal powers to do that. I think Russian state assets are a different category of legal problem. I think the practical answer to your question is there is very little in the UK. So this is really an EU problem. The Russian central bank funds, where most of this conversation takes place, are largely in Belgium, but are in the EU anyway. So it's not really a UK issue as I understand it. I think the problem with seizing central bank and state-owned funds is a different one. That comes down to sort of the immunity, sovereign immunity of different kinds, and there are endless debates about different possible legal ways around sovereign immunity problems. In other words, seizing the property of a state that are located in another state. But my understanding is the current position is that there hasn't been EU consensus on seizing Russian central bank funds for the reconstruction of Ukraine, but there is a scheme for, which I think is currently in train, where a loan is being made to Ukraine secured on the profits or generated by the state bank funds, and the UK as part of the G7 is contributing in that sense. But Tom, I don't know if you want to add, but there are lots of legal complications in either scenario.
So I'm glad you made the distinction between the central bank assets and let's just call them for the purpose of the conversation, oligarch assets, because those are two very different situations, as Maya has laid out. As relates to the Central Bank of Russia assets, I think the arguments there have been well rehearsed and won in favour of using those assets to support the reconstruction of Ukraine. The decision last year to sort of nibble at that issue, which, as Maya points out, I think was heavily driven by the position of the European Union, at least has monetised some of those assets for the benefit of Ukraine, and in this form of a loan structure that's been talked about. On the oligarch assets, I think I want to go back to something that Maya spoke about earlier on, which is this whole question of kind of off-ramps.
Sorry, hang on, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I still don't really understand. So you say that it's been settled. So are you saying that it's now settled that the money owned by the Russian state in their bank can be seized by other powers in order to pay for reconstruction in Ukraine?
The arguments exhausted themselves, I think, in favour of what you've just described during the course of last year. However, there is also a political consideration, and this is where the EU got nervous, which is that if the assets of a central bank are seized in this way, what does that mean for the integrity of assets of other central banks that are held anywhere else in the world? And there was a lot of reporting about...
Basic rule of law, isn't it?
Well, there was a lot of reporting about certain countries whispering in the ear of the European Central Bank and others about, well, we might never trust buying a euro-denominated government bond again if this is what happens to our assets. Now, my rejoinder to that is, as long as you're not planning on illegally evading a neighbour, then your central bank assets should surely be safe. So the kind of the way of coming up with a solution that kept the EU happy, and particularly certain elements of the EU happy, was to say, well, we will put together a loan that is secured against the profits that these assets, which are immobilised in Belgium, are earning. So it's no more complicated than that. But the point is that when it comes to discussing reparations, for example, again, I don't think anyone would dispute under international law that the assets of Russia should be used for reparations for Ukraine. On the oligarch assets, in summer 2023, the Ukraine Reconstruction Conference happened here in London. And at the beginning of that conference, the Foreign Office flew a kite which went along the lines of, if oligarchs are willing to donate their assets, ... And there was tumbleweed. There was, to the best of my knowledge, nobody took up that discussion with the British government. Others may have insight into this. But it does raise an important point, which is that some of these individuals who've got properties in London and so on, I mean, those properties could be frozen for the rest of their lifetime at this rate, given the way relations with Russia are. So surely at some point it's worth having a conversation about what is the off-ramp that allows them to unfreeze those assets. And of course the case that we have got right in front of us in SW6 is Chelsea Football Club, where the proceeds are sitting in a trust somewhere, which are meant to be sort of for the victims of the war in Ukraine or something like that. And the money still sits there, and we haven't yet figured out a way of unlocking the owner of those assets hold over them in order for them to be used for the benefit of victims of the war in Ukraine. So we haven't managed to solve that conundrum, which is probably an easier conundrum than what do we do about other oligarch assets that are frozen in London and UK.
Can I ask you actually about a separate case, but where in a sense the argument is even stronger and simpler? So there is a large amount of assets in London which are in the ownership of Bashar Assad. Now, it is inconceivable that we would give them back to him, or that he's going to be in a position to return to power unless something extraordinary happens. So are you saying that those assets will just sit, you know, the property, everything else that is held in London will remain technically in his ownership but untouchable?
Well, it's a good. I mean, that's the Syria sanctions regime. The Syria sanctions regime is now in a very odd situation because it's still a regime. It's still a sanctions regime directed at the Assad government and hasn't been amended to deal with the fact that Assad is no longer in power. So I imagine that the government is going to have to change that regime so that it becomes a regime directed at restoring assets of the former regime to the current regime in Syria, or something of that nature, which has happened before in sanctions regimes, but there hasn't been any legislative amendment yet to deal with the change in power in Syria.
We could legislate to achieve that.
Well, what has happened, albeit wholly unsuccessfully, what has happened in the past is that there have been sanctions regimes in the case of Arab Spring countries, where assets outside Tunisia, Libya, and so on, Egypt, have been frozen, where they have been stolen from the people of that regime with a view to them going back to those jurisdictions. None of those regimes actually resulted in any money going back to those regimes, and they were very unsuccessful sanctions regimes. But yes, that, you know, among the foreign policy goals of sanctions can be, you know, former regime money stolen from a state being restored to the state, and it may be that that's where the Syria sanctions go.
Can I ask a very similar set of questions to that with regards to the Russian sovereign assets? It seems that it's inconceivable that we would ever hand back collectively that 300 billion to Putin unless he has paid the reparations, which he's legally bound to pay, which will be more than the 300 billion. Yet, I mean, Tom, you said that the sort of legal arguments and the legal commentators have sort of exhausted themselves on the side of saying that there are ways of seizing the assets. Yet political leaders absolutely don't seem to be in that place all the way across Europe. So is there a risk that we end up in a situation where that $300 billion sits there in perpetuity, both not handed back to Putin, but also not used for the benefit of the people of Ukraine?
I think the argument for those assets being used for reparations, I think, is relatively clear. I don't think anyone would dispute that. But of course, we unfortunately have not reached that part of this process. So we obviously all hope that the war concludes, you know, as soon as possible. And at that point, I think there is decent, I think a lot of people look at the case of Iraq and Kuwait, for example, there's decent precedent on reparations. Again, the outcome is not great in terms of how much people actually get, but nonetheless using assets, I think there's good case there's a good case study there. The question is, when does that process start? And I was at a rather depressing dinner last summer where somebody said, well, the reparations process for Kuwait in the context of the Iraq invasion of 1991 has just concluded after 30 years. So it's a very, very long journey.
Not got the bodies back.
Yeah. Sorry?
They've still not got the bodies back,
exactly.
of hostages. Yeah.
Can I also ask then, if we think that's where we're inevitably getting to, given it's not clear that we have, and I know your point, Maya, about most of the money's held in Belgium, but I think about a tenth of it is held in London. Should we be passing legislation now to make clear that when we get to that stage that we will be seizing it, so we have the legislative framework to do it.
My understanding is not the same as Tom's. I had not thought that there had been a legal resolution to how it is possible to overcome the state immunity problem. As far as I know, there have been lots of international lawyers commenting on whether one can characterise this as the use of countermeasures, which is a sort of temporary measure designed to counter an international wrong. But I had not thought that legal consensus had been reached. And then politics took over. The EU didn't have a unanimous agreement to do anything with the Euroclear funds. So my current understanding is that what is happening as an alternative, I suppose, is to use profits on the Euroclear frozen funds in this sort of loan arrangement. But
I think I need to come back to you on this, because I was under the impression that, is there not legislation already which says that sanctions stay in place until reparations are paid, or something like that?
Yeah, there's been an additional sort of purpose added to the UK sanctions regime, so they can stay in place.
But if we don't give ourselves the legislative tools to seize those assets, which we don't currently have, the loans which are underwritten by those assets ultimately are for our taxpayers to underwrite. So I mean, I come back to that question. Surely we have to pass that legislation. We should do it sooner rather than later, as a statement of intent.
I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay.
I'm afraid.
I'm all in favour of statements of intent.
You think you could write back to us on this?
On what? On whether it's wise to start passing legislation now to restore Russian state assets frozen in the UK.
And Blair's point about if we've taken out loans, if we're giving loans to the Ukrainians on the basis that we will be able to get the Russian assets, then should we be passing legislation to shore that up so that we don't end up asking
British taxpayers
to pay it?
I mean, there are certainly international lawyers who could probably give more chapter and verse on that.
Right.
But I'd be happy to follow that up.
We'll go and have another look at the loan agreement.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because I have to say, I'm very far from convinced about all of this, and it is an internal debate that we have regularly about exactly what the situation is. But thank you. Right. We've reached the end of the questions, as far as I'm aware, unless anybody has anything else.
Yes, one more. Very quickly, Trump has very, very famously been talking about introducing new sanctions on Russia as a way to force Putin to the negotiation table. I wonder, Tom or others, if you had any reflections on what they might be or how effective that might be.
I will refer you to an article I wrote for the Kyiv Independent last week. But essentially, look, we are seeing every day his love of economic levers, let's call them that, tariffs. Obviously, last time round he was a maximalist on sanctions as related to Iran. I think that I can see a line that essentially says that he goes hard on sanctions on Russia in order to try and drive Putin to the negotiating table to do the great deal that Donald Trump has written about on social media. And I can see that. I mentioned earlier on about the fact that G7 allies had sort of nibbled at the edges on sanctions and perhaps not gone as hard as they could have done because of concerns about what it might do to energy markets and that sort of thing. I can see a line that says, at the end of the day, the product that is financing, that continues to finance Russia to its ability to fight the war, is the export of energy. And we, I think, have started to understand how to disrupt that. So this is this whole question of the kind of the shadow fleet that is bobbing around like a duck all over the world. And we've started to see more pressure put on that, and the pips have started to squeak. So I can see an argument where Donald Trump says, to hell with what happens to energy markets, we should go full bore on going after the energy infrastructure. And you know what, country A, B, C, if you're struggling with sourcing the oil that you need to source, hello, we're one of the largest exporters of oil in the world, and guess what? We will sell oil to you. It's a great deal for the American people. It makes money for the American people. And not only do I achieve peace, but I also achieve profit. And so I can sort of see a period of intense sanctions activity based around Russia's energy exports. And I'm sort of waiting to see that unroll when he's got a gap in his diary from not putting tariffs on people. So I think we can expect some pretty heavy action in that field.
I just had one question, I suppose, going back to sort of the effect of where we started with the effectiveness of sanctions. And I distinctly remember a long time ago hearing somebody saying that prior to the Iranian sanctions, the IRGC had control of about 5% of the Iranian economy on the basis that no one wanted to buy a toaster from the IRGC or a refrigerator. But then we imposed sanctions, and within a couple of years, they were sort of had their fingers in nearly every pie and were controlling about 80% of the Iranian economy. And obviously, we've seen with Russia a sort of growth of self-reliance. I'm just wondering whether or not, when we whole sanction an economy, we increase self-reliance within that economy, and is it true therefore that the effectiveness of sanctions actually goes down over time?
Yeah, there's a very, I mean, that's in a way why you need to undertake the shock and awe campaign, because over time the economy shapeshifts, and I can't remember who it was who raised the point earlier on about it affecting, if you like, the people. The people who profit out of sanctions are often the elite who've got the access to whatever is needed in order to continue to function. And again, I think another mistake we've made, or at least we haven't been able to operationalize our response to this, is put yourself in the shoes of the Russian regime. Sanctions, responding to sanctions, is existential for them. Their economy is falling apart. Inflation is where it is. So if they are not able to respond to sanctions, then they are in really big trouble. And I don't think we have put ourselves in those shoes and said, so how do we push that so hard that actually the existential concerns that the Kremlin has come to pass? And the result of it being an existential threat for the Kremlin is that they will do anything they possibly can to avoid those sanctions. So that's why when you see lists of sanctioned individuals coming out who are involved in procurement networks, the Russian military, they're FSB people, because they're putting their best people to work in order to circumvent sanctions. And we are not treating it with that same, so there's an asymmetry in what we do, how they respond, and the result is that, unfortunately, they are always several steps ahead.
Can I just add a footnote to that? I think one of the criticisms made of sanctions is that not enough thought goes into the cost-benefit analysis in advance and as sanctions progress about, a theme we've been talking about today. Are they working? Are they likely to work? What is the theory of how they're meant to work, and are they achieving that? And there is a very good talk, which I would be happy to send you, by Dalip Singh, who was the outgoing Biden administration Deputy National Security Advisor for International Economics, that he gave a couple of weeks ago, in which he said sanctions are so much now the knee-jerk tool of choice around the world. And he gives some interesting figures on how much the use of sanctions has rocketed. And he said he thinks that there need to be some limiting principles to limit their use. And one of the most important that he gives is that they should be used sparingly for carefully defined and achievable goals, with articulating in advance how they can actually influence the decision-making calculus of those that they're designed to influence, including in relation to individuals targeted so they can change their behaviour, but also the regime as a whole. And he encourages data-driven cost-benefit analysis about whether in fact they're going to be counterproductive. And my overall impression, although I'm not in government, is that perhaps for resourcing reasons, or perhaps because of the need for urgent political action in response to world events, that kind of calculation about are they going to work, are they going to be counterproductive, perhaps doesn't take place as often or as effectively as it could.
And if I can add to that as well, I think in order to sort of look at sanctions effectiveness, what we're very good at is putting sanctions on things. But actually, when do we really take sanctions away? When do we lift those sanctions? I often think of sanctions as sort of putting somebody in the naughty corner, on the naughty step, and sort of saying, well, look, we're going to freeze your bank account, so we're going to stop, put you on the naughty list and not do trade with you until you improve your behaviour, until you make a change. And then that happens, that person, you take them off the naughty step and off you go again. But we're not very good at taking them off the naughty step. We're not good at making sure people understand that the sanctions are coming in. But actually, what does that feel like when you lift them off? Where is the benefit? Where is the carrot that you're also giving with the stick? And I think we need to start thinking about not just imposing sanctions, but also how do we much more creatively and carefully lift them at the point of designation, at the point of imposing them. How do we do that? How do we make sure that we do that in collaboration with industry so they understand the messaging around that? I remember being in government when we had the Iran sanctions and the notification authorisation requirements were in place and they were lifted. And the government messaging at the time was to encourage UK business to re-engage with Iran, and it was so difficult. As doing engagement within government at the time, and I was talking to banks and various sectors, and everyone was still de-risking because it's about messaging and ensuring how we're doing that so that we're giving an incentive to sanctions as well as doing that as that very important foreign policy tool that we have, and it's one of many options that we have, but actually are we making sure that they're feeling the benefits of actually complying? And as Maya mentioned before, what do you have to do to have those sanctions lifted? So it's seen more as a holistic journey rather than just a punitive action all the time.
Very last question, Phil.
Tom, just another question for you, if I may. You mentioned Russian energy sector. And one mechanism that's been used to influence policy has been the oil price cap. How effective has that been as a mechanism in driving a change in behaviour?
I think, so I will freely admit that when the Treasury official who was primarily involved in designing that rang me up on a Sunday afternoon and said, what do you think of this idea? I said, it's crazy, it's never going to work. And I think actually it probably initially achieved something of an objective. It's hard to say because obviously if the oil price declines then suddenly a cap of $60, well, maybe the market is at $60, so it's not really a cap at all. I think we've probably gone beyond the point where the oil price cap has any value because, again, back to a point I made earlier on, the target shapeshifts. People figure out how to circumvent, how to react. So that's in a little bit why I think that maybe we get to a point where the new president of the United States says, well, are we going to go for the kind of full oil, the full press on oil in a way that no one was willing to do 3 years ago or 2.5 years ago when the oil price cap was first introduced. The one thing I would say that was positive about the oil price cap, and it's about the only area where the private sector points to this, is that in the design of the oil price cap, governments work very closely with the private sector. We have the following ambition. We want to achieve the following objective. Let's work on this thing that we're going to call the oil price cap. And so what you'll hear from insurance companies, from shipping companies, from all who are affected by the oil price cap is that they felt that there was a kind of a community effort on that. And we should take that case study and we should be applying it to the other areas where governments want to achieve a certain effect with their sanctions. But that doesn't happen. It's a unique case, I gather.
Very good. I think I speak on behalf of all of us that we're really grateful to you, all three of you, for coming today to give us your time and for your really interesting answers. It's a difficult area and it's one that's developing, and we do want to make sure that we get it right in order to make sure that it works as well as it can do. So anything that we can do to push that in the right direction, and your help in informing us today and the public generally is greatly appreciated. If there's anything additional that you think that we ought to know, please do write and share it with us. We would be grateful for that. So thank you again. Order.